Well, at this point we have our schedule ready. Yesterday we looked at the results from the heroic testing when it came to DPS specs. So today, the day after, we are looking at the results of the healers with the heroic testing of Larodar and Nimue, which happened this weekend on the PTR. As we approach the release of this patch, by this point we have basically just a couple of weeks before the patch goes live. There is still, of course, some hope for some specs to receive some more tuning, some more changes, but you know, with the latest PTR build being a release candidate for the release of the patch, it's less likely. It's less likely that we will continue to receive some massive major changes. So the state of the specs right now is it's getting closer. It's getting closer to their final form for the release of the patch. So today we have, once more, unlike yesterday where we did all of it manually, log by log, today instead we check once more our spreadsheet about the results of the PTR, looking at the latest 2 heroic bosses that were tested, to look at the results of the healers. This is interesting because once more, if we go through our tuning that has been done to the specs before this set of testing was available, we have gotten primarily a couple of changes to the healers. One was to Mistweaver, a whole list of changes went to Mistweaver. One was a change to the tier set of Holy Paladin and a nerf to their mana regen. We also had the buff, the small buff to Resto Shaman, as well as the latest round of tuning. This one was the one that basically nerfed the damage done of Discipline Priest. That was the only other thing for healers. So looking at the results, we start with we can say a familiar list of highest HPS results in this testing for Larodar, because it's Mistweaver and Preservation. Basically, it's the green gang of healers doing the best. Now, if we go back to just the week before, where instead of heroic it was mythic that was being tested, it was, you know, they were familiar colors on Igira. Before that we had some testing on Council, and once more you had Evoker doing well. The previous one on Igira, the first boss Gnarlroot, you know, these 2 specs were doing quite well consistently. The slightly different color we can say this time around is that there isn't nearly as much pink. Holy Paladin is not nearly as prevalent. If anything, actually, we have even more Discipline Priests compared to Paladins this time around. Now, worth pointing out, as we look at this skill right here, that the change to Holy Paladin was the one to their tier set. They have gotten their mana regen nerfed in 2 different ways, both their talent reclamation as well as the Holy Shock now costing more mana, and then there was a change to their tier set. Now, it just heals for less in return for being able to stack up to 6 times. This is not perhaps nearly as good in the raid, because in the raid you are machine gunning Holy Shock to basically every target that doesn't have Holy Shock. You're not actually incentivized in the raid to stack up the same Holy Shock 6 times on the same target, right? You want to spread Holy Shock to your maximum cap of 8 targets. So this buff in healing in the raid is basically irrelevant. It gains more value in Mythic Plus, where you have fewer players and you can stack this up. And of course, it gains much more value in damage in Mythic Plus, or even in single target on a raid boss, where you can stack this up 6 times. You can see it right here, the effect of the 4-piece set bonus in the raid, Holy Reverberation being roughly 5% of your healing, and more or less happening throughout the entire run, because of course it's off of your Holy Shock. This might be perhaps the wrong log to take a look at when it comes to the damage done, because if we look at the damage done of this Paladin, we can find the damage of the Holy Shock to be almost non-existent. The guy never basically clicked Holy Shock on the enemy except for 3 times. And you will not know this because I just cut the video, but I did spend about 10 minutes or so checking through every Holy Paladin log just to see if any Holy Paladin was actually going to bother using Holy Shock on the enemy on the boss and test the damage of this 6 times stacking dot on an enemy. Unfortunately, it looks like no Holy Paladin is actually bothering to do this. They're actually not even bothering to cast Holy Shock on enemies. So as of right now, the changes on the PTR for Holy Paladin were basically just a nerf to the tier. Mistweaver and Evoker have not really been touched, or we can say nerfed recently. We have even looked at, confusingly actually, at the changes of Mistweaver, wondering why Vivify and Invigorating Mists were being buffed by 12%, especially when you go and look at any random Mistweaver Monk log, and by this point you might be familiar with it. Every time you look at the PTR and at Mistweaver Monk, you can find Invigorating Mist doing quite a significant amount of healing. So, you know, this one being buffed by 12%, it didn't look like there was any need for Mistweaver Monk to be even further buffed. Same goes for the buff to their 4-piece set bonus Chi Harmony. The only relevant minor nerf they received in the raid was the nerf to Unison, healing less, but Unison, you know, isn't a major part of their healing done, so this one wasn't nearly as felt of a nerf to Mistweaver. So in this fight, Larodar, which, if you're not aware, just to put it in perspective, Larodar is a boss fight where the raid is, generally speaking, quite stacked. You might have not seen the fight, but the raid, besides hanging around the circle in the middle and dealing with the adds, first damaging them and then healing them, most of the raid will stay more or less in the same spot throughout the entire fight. So this is a good fight for healers that can do, you know, stacked healing, grouped healing, healing multiple players at once, like, for example, Evoker, right? This sounds like a pretty good fight, a pretty good type of fight for a Blossom Evoker, right? For a Smaragblute Evoker. You just spam your Smaragblutes on the ground and you hit the entire raid. So it's a pretty good fight for this style. When we move over, though, to a different boss, these results are changing quite a bit, because the green gang in the next fight kind of disappears. Now we are in this scuffed rainbow gang, where we have white, orange, pink and blue. And the green gang is significantly lower down, is spread in the averages. Back to Larodar, we can see there is a significant gap between these two, Mistweaver and Evoker, and the rest of the healers, or more or less, you know, between 10,000 HPS in the same bracket. And then you move to Nimue and you find almost the opposite. You see that Evoker is amongst the lowest ones, together with Mistweaver and both of the priests, and the better ones are Paladin, Shaman and Druid. Now, same concept as Volcaros, the boss where you get split into half and you have to move into two different groups. Nimue has a similar level of spreading. First of all, when you're fighting the boss, the group is already somewhat spread around, so the value of stacked group heals, like for example Sanctify of a Holy Priest or Blossom of an Evoker, are already quite low value. And then things get even worse when you have to go in the intermission, where you do spread into two different groups. So this makes it even worse for the specs that can heal stacked groups, stacked raid groups when you do this. So it is more logical that healers that are excelling at this type of group healing, like for example Preservation Evoker, even to a degree Holy Priest, especially with their new tier set, which allows them to spam Sanctify. Sanctify more or less has the same range, the same circle of Blossom, doing quite badly. And then healers without too many issues healing fewer amount of players, like Resto Shaman, like Holy Paladin, with their cap of Glimmer at 8 targets. They don't mind if the group is split into half, so they have a better result with this type of boss. Still good to know that Resto Shaman, previously thought a spec with very many issues as a healer, after the few sets of buffs they received, are now doing, you know, consistently better compared to before. Now they have more or less permanently swapped their weapon of choice from Healing Wave to Chain Heal. This allows them to have way more consistent healing and also bigger bursts of healing thanks to Chain Heal. It's good to know they are in a much better situation than before. What we could put the focus on for today is on one particular spec, which is Discipline. We have looked at previous boss fights, even in the ones that were in Mythic, and we were worried about Discipline not being, you know, nearly as strong, being quite lower down the rest of the healers on average. They have received not that many buffs over the course of the last few patches. This one wasn't even a buff. It was just a change in fact a nerf to do lower damage, because if there is one thing they are excelling at right now as healers is their damage. So when it came to actual healing, it's good to see that now Discipline can also match up with pretty high HPS at the moment. So So this one being Larodar. Discipline Priest now has even better ways to use their ramp. They don't just have their normal style of ramp, the normal ramp, the ramp with Rapture, the ramp with Evangelism. Now they also have Ultimate Penitence, which isn't even a ramp. It's actually almost instant in how quickly you can use this with a couple of radiances and apply 20 atonements to the entire raid. So it has been made better in multiple facets of the game. And then of course, if we look at the damage, even after the nerfs, this is post 9% damage nerf, by the way. After, they are still pulling over 40,000 DPS, matching the tanks and absolutely destroying the other healers. So whenever you have this type of healer with this type of damage, which would also show up actually even higher because of this thing called Power Infusion. Even after the nerf, on average, Power Infusion would still be giving a priest somewhere around 7-ish thousand DPS. So this real number would be closer to 50k and be actually here. So the value of this damage is quite high. If you consider that their healing is also competitive, then it becomes a real boon to your raid. At the end of this boss, which was still a wipe, for example, these two Discipline Priests gave, compared to these three other healers, gave 10 million more damage each, which is 2%, which is 2% each of the boss's HP. So these two Disc Priests were responsible for doing 4% boss damage, more than the other healers. It is quite the powerful thing to take into consideration, on top of the Power Infusion, on top of perhaps you not running, for example, a Shadow Priest, so wanting, of course, Fortitude buff, not to mention things like Barrier as well as a powerful cooldown. So it's good to see Discipline now performing better, especially because perhaps, in the PTR on 1 hour testing cycles, Discipline was perhaps hard to get used to. Discipline is one of the healers that requires more preparation, more prep time, more understanding of the boss, because you have to prep your windows of healing, your ramps, etc., as opposed to something quite easy to just plug and play on any encounter like a Mistweaver Monk or even an Evoker. So it's good now that you see also Discipline Priest doing well. And to be fair, Holy, even in this fight, even though Discipline Priest is doing better, they are still not that terrible. Yes, technically they have the lowest healing, technically they are just about the lowest healing, but it's still an acceptable gap. If you have 5 different healing specs between 106 and 116,000 HPS, that's an average of 8% healing done difference across 5 different specs. So it's a pretty good number to be at, which is sort of the TLDR of the healing done, as opposed to the DPS that we have looked at yesterday, where we do have some very high highs and some pretty low lows of different specs. The healers at the moment seem to be at a much more balanced state. You do see perhaps the 2 slight outliers being Mistweaver and Preservation, but in multiple other fights you have seen other specs doing well, other specs proving that in perhaps certain encounters, certain types of healing profiles, they're still doing quite well overall. Everyone more or less got their chance of doing well, from Resto Shaman to Resto Druid to Holy Paladin, and now even Discipline Priest, together with the 2 ones we already knew were doing well, which were Mistweaver and Preservation. As I said, the only one who is perhaps not sort of keeping up with having some time in the spotlight has been Holy Priest throughout all of this PTR cycle, but it is still not in nearly as bad of a state as a few of the other DPS specs we have mentioned when looking at the results of the DPS, like talking about, for example, the state of specs like Marksmanship Hunters, for example, or Windwalker Monk, maybe even Frost DK. The healer specs, even the ones that weren't doing nearly as well, are currently in a much better, in a much brighter position. So more than ever, more than certainly this expansion as a whole, we have a situation within the healers that is very even, very balanced, very difficult even to guess which healer might become the healer of choice at the release of this next patch. For Mythic Plus, it's a different question. There are definitely way bigger advantages to certain specs in Mythic Plus, like for example still Holy Paladin and nowadays even Discipline Priest, but when it comes to the raid, they are more, they're all closer to each other. They all start within a much closer gap amongst themselves, and they all have more or less one or two points for themselves to be a meta spec in the raid with the release of the next patch. At the very least for healers, the situation is very good as we approach the release of the patch. We hope still to see a few more changes in the tuning. As I said, perhaps the only one who might receive a few more buffs is Holy Priest, and as well I think Restoration Druid. Those are the only two ones left, perhaps for a few more bumps in terms of buffs, and then we are pretty much there as far as healer balance overall is concerned. So with this recap, as far as it goes for healers, we are now done on this Tuesday. We can now start our goodbyes by thanking, as usual, all of the Patreon supporters for the contribution and the help to the growth of the channel, which can still be given completely for free. You can like and comment down below, as well as subscribe to the channel itself. So, with these irrelevant things out of the way, thank you guys again for watching. See you guys tomorrow, and in the meantime, I just hope all of this balance will just end up not mattering, because the answer will be, we need more power infusions. That would be sad.